Welcome back, everyone, to Off the Top Podcast. You're officially in season 2, something we didn't think about when we first started getting into podcasting and how it evolved and how we'd become so comfortable with it. But season 2, and we're just going to dive into essentially what a lot of people have been asking us is, how do you podcast?
That's a very good question. And I feel like when you think about it, well, now at this point in season 2, which is extraordinary, and wouldn't think I would actually be on a season 2, to be honest. I think it's now something where we have somewhat of a seasoning with as far as podcasting goes.
I agree too. And I think that brings me to the first point of what I thought about when we started our podcast or thinking of podcast categories is finding that idea that isn't short term, but isn't super broad. So essentially what I'm trying to say is like, if you're thinking about doing a podcast, the first thing you want to find is that idea. And you want to make sure it doesn't pigeonhole you into only talking about Charlize Theron for a whole season or something along those lines.
Exactly. And the reason why you want to have like a strong idea in an aspect is if you want this podcast to be successful, you don't need to have a good idea that you like, but it's way easier if you do. And so you'll be doing this, sometimes week after week or day after day. And if you have something that is literally limiting you from doing podcasts, then you know that there's some sort of problem.
And we don't say like things can limit you into just like there's nothing to do. Like I mentioned, there is a podcast out there about Charlize Theron that is, I think, 60 podcasts long, which is a lot of podcasts on one person. So if you're creative enough, you can make that idea really work. But if you're struggling to find ideas, it's where, making a podcast can be difficult because even as, we don't necessarily have a niche area, finding idea topics can be difficult for us.
I think that's a very good point. And the reason why, too, is when you go back to something where it's very niche, you might run into, let's say, if we wanted to talk about all the movies that a certain actor was in, we only have X amount of podcasts equaling, the amount of movies that they're in. And the other hand, when it comes off the top where we're really broad, I feel like it's hard to get ideas, one, and then it's also, I feel like, a little hard to gain traction in such a broad category, right?
Yeah, I think with that being said, it's one of those things that people, our listeners, we're super thankful for you guys, but you've probably noticed like we aren't always going down a science route or always going down a sports route. We're trying to hit on, everything that comes up and that we think is interesting and just try to share that with you guys and conversate that way. And that kind of makes me lead into what I think is the next thing I think about is, what is your basis of your podcast? So Jordan, I got to ask you, like, what was the moment you realized, we should, get together and do a podcast?
To be fair, man, I think that the moment that I believed that we should get together and do a podcast was probably a couple episodes deep in our podcast, which sounds really funny, but I think it's just one of those things where, you have conversations with people and they're super casual. And that's how we started off the top, as you can read in our bio. But at the same time, it's never something where you think that it could just be created into this podcast or made into this almost produced into this medium. So for me, I think that there's a very interesting shift in your head of, oh, this should be something that's podcast worthy. But Julian, now I'm curious, when did you believe?
The first thing I want to touch on is you had a very valid point there. If I could kind of surmise, it would be like, you have to test out. Like if you're thinking about doing a podcast, you have to test it out. I wouldn't necessarily just be like, oh, I thought of this idea, but I'm not too sure how it's going to work, so I'm not going to try it. Try it. And if you like it, but you don't like the topic, you can always change the topic and find a different route to go. But in regards to your question, when I realized that we could probably do a podcast is when we were living together. And there was like a string of probably like 6 weeks where we were just chilling in the kitchen. One of us was most likely eating and the other one was just kind of stumbling in. And we'd have these really unique, interesting, just kind of flying off the handle conversations about whatever we felt like. And it just kind of flowed, and it felt like some, conversations we had previously. And we just decided to try to get creative and shift that over to the podcast zone.
Yeah. So I'm really curious, to be honest, and I know that we couldn't figure this out easily, but I'm really curious on if other people podcast this way or how other people started. I'm sure it wouldn't have been such a natural instinct of or like convergence from just pure random conversation to a podcast, but I'm sure that is the case for other reasons. And that kind of gives me another point of, how would you produce a podcast? I think that if I can drop the hint on podcast success, it would be consistency.
Oh, 100%. And that's a thing that you could really struggle with a podcast. In my opinion, it's nice to start at once a week. I think anything longer than every week, you're not going to pick up traction. But I think if you're shooting to do every single day, you're going to learn that trying to create a podcast every single day and allocating that time, if you have a job or school or other things going on, can make the quality of your podcast suffer. And I think you brought a very good point to the table about how you're doing and how you're producing and when you're producing your podcast.
And even if you think about consistency, it's not always when you produce or how you produce, it's what you produce in the same aspect. So it depends. You want to be consistent in a few things so your listeners have something to expect. So for instance, if I came out one podcast crazy, like loud and flamboyant, and the next podcast you could barely hear me because I was talking so soft spoken, there's a level of unexpectedness that kind of turns people away at the end of the day, where if they know your brand, which is one of our episodes, probably, to be honest, not to digress, but that was our most popular episode. So I want to thank you guys for that while it's in my head. And so if people know your brand and know what to expect from you, they'll be more likely to come to you and enjoy your podcast.
It's funny that you say, or you talk about the personal brand episode, because I actually just went back and listened to it this week while I was at work. And that's one thing that kind of came to my mind, is that I never really listened to a full one of our podcasts, maybe because it was, we record it, we were there, we remember it. But that's one of the tips that I've picked up this week, was like, listening to your own podcast. You don't have to listen to every episode. Maybe listen to an episode every 3 months to understand, your improvements and your transitions. But you also pick up things that you don't notice while you're recording. And so, for instance, I brought up to something to Jordan before this podcast. That's something we're doing on here that, could affect essentially the flow of conversation or get really repetitive. And I think it's something that's going to be really beneficial in the long run for us.
100%. I totally agree with you. And I agree with, first off, I want to applaud you for being brave enough to listen to our old stuff, because some of it is kind of like, cringe inducing, I would say. So we've came a long way, which is not to say that you want to not evolve throughout your podcast and become a better podcaster, have better speaking skills. But at the same time, you want to have some sort of idea of who you would like to be as a podcaster and go with it, kind of thing, if you know what I'm saying.
Exactly. And a thing you kind of touched on too is some of your older stuff when you start a podcast is going to be rough. For example, when we started this podcast, Jordan was recording on his headphones microphone, which were actually pretty good. And I was recording on a $6 lapel mic from Amazon. And then we slowly found kind of different equipment, a different, platform to be on, a different way to edit. And it slowly evolved. You aren't going to get A1 quality right out of the gate. And even if you have the equipment to make it A1, it doesn't mean your podcast itself will be A1.
And if I can say, that transition was A1 to what I was going to talk about after this, is kind of the logistics and everything. Like Julian said, we were just doing it how we could in the beginning of the podcast. Now we both have somewhat bona fide mics, and I hope you can tell through the sound quality, which is very important to us. And that also means that get your logistics down. Whether your logistics are, I want to have good audio for my fans, make sure that that's taken care of. Or if you want to have a podcast with somebody that happens to be in another country, which we know a little bit about, you got to make sure that you have the tools and everything to be able to do that and kind of like plan it out.
And that's something we've harped on in the past in some podcasts is something everyone takes for granted, but your accessibility to information in today's generation is outstanding. No one came to us, or there's no mentor for us that said, this is how you run a podcast. This is the platform you'll be on. This is the program you'll use to edit. We went out and found it all on our own. We did our own research, listened to podcasts, found out what we liked and didn't like, and try to transition that into our own. And that way, what we created is essentially our own. Off the top is all Jordan and I's ideas, how we want to format it, and it isn't a mimic of something else.
I couldn't have said it better. I would say that Off the Top is its own, and it's not a mimic of anything else, but it's an interpretation of us as human beings. And as we're influenced, the podcast becomes influenced by certain things subtly. And once again, I'm really curious, Julian, what was the most difficult practical thing that we need to figure out as far as you saw?
I think the most difficult thing when we first were starting is essentially, how do you get your podcast out there? I'm not talking how do you get it to how do you get it to grow an audience, but how do you get it somewhere that people can reach it? So we started on SoundCloud, and if you're an original SoundCloud member, we salute you. And we put it on SoundCloud so that it was on the internet and it was findable. And if we wanted to share it, we could. And then, from there, once you find out how to put it out there, is when your next steps of figuring out, how do I want to grow this podcast, as what follows. You don't want to ever go into a project or something saying, how am I going to get it as big as possible first? First, you want to just lay the foundation. Like, how am I going to get it there so people can see it, and then I can turn it into what I want to turn it into?
I think you just answered the question of a lot of great ideas on the internet. And not to like toot our own horn, but I think that you can have $1 billion idea, but if you can't get it out to the right people, then it's the equivalent of having just a crap idea, right? So when it comes to getting your podcast out there, you got to make sure that you're putting it out in the right spots. And also it helps if you first kind of endorse it with your personal account, maybe, or if you don't have any social media presence, you endorse it through word of mouth or anything like that, because at the end of the day, the internet is a very, very big ocean, and you are one little drop of water. So you got to give people a reason to notice your, drop of water in that ocean, and go to it to make it become more prevalent and more salient in the end.
Yeah. And if you guys are coming to, this point, or you've made it to this point and you're looking for that magic sauce, well, I mean, the truth hurts, but there isn't a magic sauce to making a podcast and, being the next Joe Rogan experiment, or being something along those lines. Like we touched on before, some of the things that are really, if you're really interested in growing your podcast, it's going to be, quality. It's going to be that consistency. It's going to be how you're making it personal to you and unique from others. Because if you've made a podcast or you're thinking about it, the barrier to entry is extremely low. All you need is a device to record something. So essentially you could just use your phone, and you just need somewhere to upload it. And those are the 2 steps you need. We've talked about editing and a few other things, but you could put a raw podcast up there and share it. but you're also going to be competing with some of the big dogs in the industry. And that's what Jordan's talking about, being that small drop in the ocean. You have to find a way to make yourself stand out or make yourself shareable or able to spread.
Exactly. And that's how you slowly build. And one thing that you mentioned, Julian, that I wanted to kind of revisit was that there's no secret sauce. It's the way that I almost laughed when you said it, because it reminded me of like giving hard like advice to like a newly wedded couple or something. Like it just doesn't happen. You got to work on it every day. But it really is. There's nothing secret about it. You have to create the chemistry. You have to work on timing. You have to do those things. And when you do those things and you execute right, you slowly get bigger and bigger. And big dogs like, big dogs out there won't be able to just swallow your podcast whole and, poop it out on the other end, basically saying that you'll become more bona fide, get more of a following, and it grows like that.
And further to that point, one of the things I think about too is every day that you wait to do this, or every day you, take that extra step, or the longer you wait, the more people are entering. Podcasts are becoming slowly larger and larger since they've always been around. There's people who've been doing podcasts for 15 years at this point. But now it's really kind of steamrolling and picking up quick. So if you really want to, join on, making your podcast and start going, and your goal is to, make it a job, you have to start now. But in some other cases, like Jordan and I, we started this podcast and continue to this podcast to look back on in 20 years and see what we were looking at as 20-year-olds, and the things we're talking about and the things going on in this world, as almost, a virtual time capsule.
Julian, I feel like we messed up in a big way where we didn't mention, I think one of the most important reason or like things to starting a podcast is figure out your why, or the most important reason to find any, start doing anything. And figuring out why you're doing something, like why we're doing this podcast and how it spawned from, is as equally as important as all the other stuff, because it kind of navigates you. It gives you this compass that says, okay, like I'm in the middle of this podcast world, in the middle of the podcast ocean, and I got to figure out how to get home. So you got to have that direction or that sense of, what am I doing this for? Or else you kind of happen to be pushed and pulled any direction, and then you somewhat become aimless, if that makes sense, right?
Exactly. And so far we've kind of touched on figuring out your topic, figuring out if it's something you can do for long term, if that's the goal. The most important thing about figuring out why, little things like your consistency and, giving it your personality. And those are kind of broader topics. But I think it's time for us to kind of jump into some of the things that are a little bit more strategic about essentially having a podcast. And one of the things I kind of want you to expand on is, the importance of data.
Yeah, that is extremely important. The data that you will get from your podcast will tell you a lot about what is happening with your audience, with your podcast, of like everything of that nature. So for instance, even in this podcast episode, I mentioned that our building your personal brand was our most popular episode. How do I know that? Because of the data. And granted, throughout my kind of professional work experience, I've gotten really, really comfortable with aggregating and moving around and massaging and making reports out of data. But in the same aspect, it wouldn't take much for any, layman to learn what their data is about on their podcast. And the more important thing to understand, or not even to understand the data, but to understand what the data is telling you. There's stories to these numbers. And the second that you realize what that story is, you're going to get a lot more color to the picture of your podcast. And by the way, while it's on my mind, once again, shout out to all our Virginia listeners. You guys are the real ones. You're putting everybody else to shame. So I'm going to just show you some serious love right now. Once again, data.
Exactly. And like the thing about data, and you made a really great point, is there's a big picture connected to data. Seeing that the world I work in now is heavily on numbers as well, but looking at, you can look at a number and say, this podcast had, I don't know, say you're just starting, this podcast had 5 listens, and, our podcast 3 weeks ago had 3 listens. What is the difference here? And maybe you extract from that data, oh yeah, I posted it to my Facebook, or I posted it to Reddit, or the topic was trending. And that's something that the data isn't going to infer. So understanding where that's coming from is going to help you, take a direction with your podcast and how to scale it.
I couldn't have said it better, honestly, Julian. It might not always be obvious what you're getting told through the numbers of your podcast. So you have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the data. Like, okay, so this number is bigger than this one. Why? And like you said, if you can reverse engineer why that is through your own actions, then you can make a market difference, or you can make a market difference every single time you do that podcast, because this technique gives me more listens, or this technique seems like people from this area listen to it more. But that's it. And I know it's hard to get data. I mean, it took us a while to get data. I literally had to bother somebody and, consistently message them and ask and ask and ask. But once you get it, it kind of opens doors on the context that you don't get when you can't see the woods through the trees type deal.
You may be asking why are we talking about data and what makes it so important? My podcast is just going to grow organically. That's great. That's what you want. You want your podcast to shoot up organically as quick as possible and grow if that's your goal and that's your why. And taking this data is what is essentially is going to make you money. If you want to make money from a podcast, data is going to be your key in that door. Yeah, you might have a great personality. Yeah, you might be super funny. Yeah, you might be the smartest person in this niche audience. But if you go to a company and they say, or a company comes to you and says, hey, we want to sponsor you. What is your listens? What is your demographic? Where are you reaching? What's your growth projection? And you're just like, well, I'm doing pretty good organically. There's nothing to back it up. And that way they either come to you or you come to them and say, you present this case of this is my data. This is why we're doing well. This is why we think we're going to work for you, or why our podcast is going to help you benefit. And that's how you can benefit us. And that's how we make additional income from our podcast.
That's a perfect reason why you'd want to know data. And another reason too, I feel like, is to become a better podcaster. Like, how would I know to shout out Virginia people if I didn't know that they are holding it down through the data on almost every single podcast? And another thing that data does too, this is the intricate part of data, is that when you're on multiple platforms, which you probably will be once you're consistent, once you get your idea down, once you start producing podcasts for a little bit and get somewhat of a following, you'll get platforms here and there. And so the data will be spread out through all of these platforms that you're on. If you can get some clear and good data, you'll be able to paint all the stories of who's listening to your podcast, when they're listening to your podcast, and everything in between. So in that case, it makes you more attractive to your, possible endorsers. And it also makes you more attractive in the sense that you have that context. I mean, before we even knew, before we got a chance to look at our data, I had no idea, really. I knew somewhat, vague listens or downloads just because, I was kind of like looking at the platforms. But before that, if you were to tell me what's my biggest demographic, or like what's my biggest area, Julian, I'm sure that I would be, shooting in the dark somewhere.
hmm And essentially, throughout this podcast today, we've thrown at you guys a ton of information, and you may be asking, I want to know how to edit, and I want to know a little bit more marketing strategies, and I want to know, what are some of the ways you guys brainstorm ideas. We're likely to give those out. Just we're just trying to give you the basis of building this podcast. And if you really like this, go ahead and share this podcast and, leave some comments or email us at the off the top podcast at gmail.com. But before we go, Jordan, what's your, last or big tip about starting or how to podcast?
I would say my last tip is, and this is a tip not just for podcasts, but everything, is to have fun with it. If you're doing this and you hope it to become something as, the biggest podcast ever, or you just want to have something where you're just like, oh, I remember doing that. Like that was fun. It is way better if you have fun during the process. And that's not a requisite for doing anything, but it's a supplement for everything. So, that's what I would leave off as, to be honest. It's been a windy journey and we find ourselves here and find ourselves in exciting situations, which I'm, it's just a momentum thing now, but yeah, that's all I got, to be honest. Just have fun.
Yeah, perfect. I think I'll go in a different direction. I'll go a little bit more, I guess, detailed for mine. And broad detailed, I'd say, is if you guys are doing this and you have a goal, reverse track it. And by reverse track it, I mean, when Jordan and I started this, one of the first things we talked about was, how cool would it be to get 20 listens an episode? And then we talked about, how do we get there? And that's where we laid essentially our podcast plan or business plan. We're going to upload once a week. These episodes are going to be this long. We're going to cover this range of topics. We're going to have fun. We're going to do it at this time, and reverse tracked it from, we're at 20 goals and how did we get there? Because if you start at, how do I get to, or, essentially just start like, first we have to make an episode. That's great. But if you are just making that episode and you don't understand the next step or the next hurdle that could come from it, you may be lost in the sauce.
Absolutely. And once again, guys, talking about making podcasts, it makes me so nostalgic and so appreciative. So I just want to thank you guys once more. The people that are showing us love, keep showing us love. And, to be honest, it would be awesome if you guys reached out and, just gave us a little hint of, like what makes it so great. I know off the top podcast is great, but if you dropped a little DM, it might be late night, it might be morning, who knows? But some people are up, some people aren't, and that's the email by the bed, if you know what I mean.
And sadly, as much as you guys email us and show us these proof and this record, you'll never be the fastest archaeologist podcast on the planet. That's always going to be off the top.
Yeah, we'll never give the secrets out either, so don't expect that podcast.
Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll catch you next time.